Are you having a harder time grilling up thicker cuts of steak to a perfect medium rare without drying them out? Cooking up thicker cuts of steak, basically anything over an inch thick, is actually quite easy, and I personally prefer it. So in this video, I'm going to give you guys a general guide, easy steps to follow to ensure that you can cook up any cut of steak to perfection. Let's dive in. Alright, so to give you guys some background, for me personally, when I cook up a steak, an 1.5 inch cut is the perfect cut for a steak. And I know some of you out there are probably thinking, that's too much steak for me. Well, if you're eating it by yourself, yes, I agree. That's probably a lot to eat by yourself, especially if you're not a huge steak fan. I'm a huge steak fan. But it's also the perfect steak to share with people. And I'll talk about later how you should cut it to get the most out of it. But really, anything under an 1.5 inch, at least again, for me personally, it's just going to cook way too fast. You're not going to get the most flavor out of it. It's just a quick, simple sear on the barbecue grill. And then I will generally reserve those inch or less cuts of steak to use on like sandwiches or tacos or things like that. But I'm talking about like high quality, thick steak for dinner that you would find at a steakhouse. And yes, I'm aware a lot of steakhouses will sell you an inch cut, but the good ones will give you an 1.5 inch, because with an 1.5 inch, you can control the temperatures a lot better. You can get it to be mouth-watering with the perfect sear, with the perfect crust, and you can really play with the flavors. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume you already know all that, and that's why you're here, and you want to learn how to cook thicker cuts of steak. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, anything greater than an 1.5 inch, like for example 2 inches, for me starts to feel kind of like a roast. You're now making a prime rib roast or something. And some folks love 2-inch thick steaks, and I agree, they're delicious. I mean, you're not losing too much from an 1.5 inch to 2 inches, but anything over 2 inches, you're really starting to push it. So keep that stuff in mind. All right, let's start with the steps. The first step, and probably one of the most important steps, is make sure you are selecting high quality meat. Doesn't matter if it's a ribeye, a filet mignon, a porterhouse, whatever. Try to get at least USDA choice grade, but if you can, get prime. If you're going to make a thicker cut of steak, a thick cut of steak like a steakhouse, get the best quality. It really makes a big difference. Don't go and buy select. Get USDA choice or prime. Or if you want to go higher than that, Wagyu or whatever. Although Wagyu, you're not going to find an 1.5 inch. That'd be nuts. That'd be expensive. But my point is, invest in quality. This isn't the time to be cheap. The next step is, should you get a bone-in steak or boneless steak? Well, bone-in steak, the bone itself is actually going to add a ton of flavor. You can do a lot with the bone later too. You can make a broth out of it, you can give it to your dog, whatever. But a bone-in steak adds in flavor and keeps moisture within the steak. And the bone is actually going to add in some protection when you're cooking. It's going to be kind of like a heat shield. If you're, doing low and slow, all that stuff just kind of adds to your benefit, right? So bone in is something that I prefer. I know a lot of folks will say, well, you're buying a bone and you're wasting money and all that. Boneless may seem like a better deal, but also keep in mind that butcher shops, grocery stores, whatever, they're accounting for the fact that they had to remove the bone. So they're charging you for it anyways. They're just not advertising it. The third step, and this is another important, crucial step, you have a thick piece of meat. You can't expect to season it 10 minutes before you're going to grill it and expect all that flavor to go into the steak, right? It's just impossible. So it's extremely important to dry brine your steak. If you don't know what dry brining is, it basically means salting your steak or salting your cut of meat ahead of time and allowing the salt to penetrate through. This is going to do several things. It's going to allow the flavor to seep through, the salt to seep through. It's also going to draw moisture out, and you're probably thinking, well, moisture, it's going to be dry and tough. No, it's going to get most of the surface moisture out. So when it comes time to sear it, you should still pat the steak dry when it comes time to sear it, but it's just going to aid in searing. But more importantly, it's going to maximize flavor. Salt is a very important thing. Salt is one of the most fundamental things that a chef needs to master, and mastering salt really distinguishes a pro between a beginner or home chef or whatever. I have a video all about salt. I can't go through it all here. This video would be extremely long, but I do have a dedicated video. Go check it out. Long story short, salt draws out the flavor, brings the flavors forward so you can easily taste it. And ultimately what it's doing is it's enhancing flavors. So how long should you dry brine for? At least a couple of hours, depending on the cut. But let's assume you're doing an 1.5-inch cut steak, and it's all trial and error, right? You'll learn how to salt brine once you've done it a couple times. Personally, I prefer to at least salt brine for 3 or 4 hours minimum before cooking up a thick steak. What kind of salt should you use? You want to use kosher salt. Kosher salt is always the best salt for meats. Coarse kosher salt is always the best salt for meats. And then there's also finishing salts, which we'll talk about later. It's one of the steps, but kosher salt brine for a couple of hours, and that's going to really greatly improve the flavor of your steak. The 4th step is kind of related to the last step, but keep your seasoning simple. A high quality steak in of its own is delicious, and you want to taste that beefy flavor. That's what you're paying for when you buy a prime ribeye, for example, or whatever. I don't like to over season my steaks. I want to taste the flavors. So salt, pepper, garlic is more than enough. You can always do things later if you want. You can always finish with things later if you want. That's one of the steps we're going to be talking about. But when it's raw and you're preparing it and you're ready to grill, just keep it simple. Just keep it salt, pepper, and garlic. Experiment later, but I guarantee you that's more than enough. All right, so now it's time to actually grill up the steak. What should you do? You gotta master the reverse sear method. You can get sous vide-like results with the reverse sear method, and once you've mastered it, you're never gonna go back, as long as you control your temperatures. So part of the reverse sear method is also making sure that you understand and master 2-zone cooking. So when you're setting up your barbecue grill, if you're, for example, using charcoal, use the charcoal baskets, right? Use the charcoal baskets, dump your charcoal in those baskets and move them over to the side. That's your hot zone. That's going to be your sear zone. On the indirect heat side, where there's no coals, that's where your steak's going to go. Adjust your vents, lower the temperatures, and that really is how you should cook a thick steak, the reverse sear method. It's the same thing with gas grills, right? Turn off the burners. That's going to be your indirect side where your steak's going to go. And then the burners that are on, adjust your temperatures. That's going to be your direct side later for searing. Number 6 is going to be related to step number 5, which was indirect cooking and reverse sear. Master low and slow cooking. See, cooking is basically a function of temperature and time. The more you increase the temperature, the less time you have to wait, but the more moisture that's evaporating and more flavor that's being lost. So if you can find that balance of heat and temperature and time, then you can master flavor. Low and slow is just another way of lowering your temperatures and increasing the duration a little bit of cooking whatever it is that you're cooking to maximize flavor. I'm not asking you to go cook a brisket. I'm not expecting you guys to lower the temperatures to, like, I don't know, 200 degrees Fahrenheit and your steak takes like 4 hours to cook. That's not what I'm asking. But when you're using the reverse sear method and you're cooking up a steak, there is no reason for your barbecue grill to be 500, 600 degrees Fahrenheit. All you're doing is just drying out the steak. So lower your temperatures a bit, maybe like 300 degrees, 275, 350, something like that. A nice, happy equilibrium state to allow the steak to cook without drying out. Number 7, and this is another important one, use a thermometer. We just discussed how important temperature and time is, so you should probably keep an eye on your temperatures, both internal and external. I prefer thermometers that have multiple sensors so I can monitor the internal temperatures of the food, the surface temperatures that it's cooking at, and the ambient temperatures, which is just above the surface temperature of the food, so I know exactly what's going on. The reverse sear method, like I said before, can give you sous vide-like results, but you have to keep a close eye on the surface temperature and make sure that you are not rushing the cook. You don't need to worry about that right now. Just get any thermometer that allows you to monitor at least the internal temperature and the ambient temperature of the cooking environment, and that should be enough to keep an eye on things and make sure you have a juicy steak. Number 8, and I promise we're almost there. You want to sear hot and fast. When it's time to sear, get those coals or turn up the burners or whatever you got to do to maximize the temperature. And this would be a good time to also remove the steak and allow it to pre-rest, which is basically resting before you sear it, and that's all you need to do. But remove the steak depending on what you want. I'm assuming you want medium rare. I like to remove the steak once it hits about 118 degrees Fahrenheit, because I found that after I'm done searing it, it's going to hit a perfect temperature of 130 to 135 degrees, and that's the temperature that I love for my steaks. Remove your steak from the heat while the temperatures are rising, your coals are getting hot, your steak is actually resting. That's all it needs to rest. Once everything is ripping hot, put the steaks back on direct heat and sear it for that perfect crust. Searing, your preference on searing is entirely up to you. Some folks love the grill marks. I don't really prefer grill marks. I like having an even crust all around. But searing is very important. Make sure you guys get a good crust. Okay, tip number 9, and this goes back to what I said earlier about sharing a thicker cut of steak. If you are sharing a thicker cut of steak, personally, I actually like to slice my steaks open. I like to show the quality of the steak. I like to show off and show that perfect medium rare center. Cut your steaks or slice your steaks horizontally at about 45 degrees. It's going to give this very flattering look, mouth-watering look, and it just gives this perfect presentation. Now, if you're sharing a steak, which most of you probably will for an 1.5-inch cut, slicing the steaks ensures that you stop the cooking process so it doesn't overcook internally, and it just lets you divide the steak up perfectly so you can share it without killing each other. Okay, my last tip number 10. Here's the perfect time to start, finishing the steak with additional flavors. I personally like to finish a great steak by adding in my finishing salt. Usually it's coarse sea salt made by Maldon. Maldon is a beautiful coarse sea salt that has large crystals, gives that crunch, and really, again, draws out the flavor of the steak. I also like to finish with finishing pepper. Whatever you guys want. I like Tella cherry peppers, but I'll finish with black pepper, Tella cherry peppers, and again, I'll go coarse. Now, some folks love to cook their peppers and they'll season with peppers before. Some folks hate the taste of burnt peppers and they want fresh peppers for that heat. I like both. So I'll season and cook the steak with pepper, and then I'll finish with pepper. Lastly, if you really want to, if you're really going for this flavor, you can also add additional flavors as you see fit. Like, for example, a lot of people like to brush on rosemary and a garlic butter sauce, which is delicious. I'm sure it's delicious. Some folks will make a garlic butter parsley sauce or thyme sauce, whatever you feel is necessary. But that, in my opinion, is a finishing sauce, right? You put that in at the end. So here's your chance to really enhance the flavors if you want. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can always put the sauce on the side and allow people to dip in the sauce. So oftentimes, if I'm making a sauce, it's on the side. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative. And if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel membership so we can continue making videos like this one. I'll catch you on the next video.